Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Rakha Kodash. Yahweh is the name of the Heavenly Father in the ancient Hebrew. Bahasham, meaning in the name of Yahweh Shai, who is the name of his only begotten Son, alright, who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ. I want to give double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. Alright, this is going to be a continuation of Daniel, the 11th chapter. All right, and Lord's will, I'll finish off the series with this video. All right, from the 36th verse on down to the 45th verse. Okay, and so yeah, we're just gonna go right into it. All right, so last time we ended off with 11 and 35. Okay, going into the it says here, and some of them of understanding shall fall, going into the time of, after the Lord had raised up the Maccabees, and certain Israelites to fight, and help Israel out in this, in this time. Okay, some of them still had to go through certain deaths, tortures to try them and to make them pure. Okay, so now dealing with verse 36. Okay, we're now still dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes. All right. So it says here, and the king shall do according to his will. Now this is dealing with, the king here is dealing with Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes. Okay, and it says, shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. Okay, so now when you go, when you deal with Antiochus Epiphanes, he was a very, very proud individual. Okay, so much so that he magnified himself to the level of a god. Okay, really above, that's why it says magnify himself above every god. Okay, so above the gods of the Greeks, the Romans, and even against the God of the Hebrews, which is Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai. Okay, and I believe it speaks about that also in Daniel, the 8th chapter. All right, that's also talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, that little horn. Okay, and it says here, and also when you read about Antiochus, Epiphanes, let's actually pull it up. He was the first Seleucid king to use divine epithets. All right, now an epithet is basically like a word or term to sort of describe you, attributed to yourself. All right, but he was so proud that he used divine epithets. Okay, meaning words that people would use basically to describe godlike traits. He attributed that to himself. All right, so it says here, Antiochus was the first Seleucid king to use divine epithets on coins, perhaps inspired by the Bactrian Hellenistic kings who had earlier done so. Or else building on the ruler cult that his father Antiochus the Great had codified within the Seleucid Empire. These divine epithets included Theos Epiphanes, manifest God. See, manifest God, right? And after his defeat of Egypt, Nikephoros, bringer of victory. All right. So now let's go back. All right, and it says, "And shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods." Now, you gotta understand, speaking not only in words but also in actions. Okay, as they say, actions speak louder than words. Okay, now when Antiochus entered proudly into our sanctuary, you think Israelites weren't trying to stop him? You think they didn't tell him, that certain places he couldn't go into because it was only for the priests? Okay, but nonetheless, he still did it anyway. Okay, now with his proud mindset, do you think when they told him that he respected it? No. All right. Now the scriptures don't give specific accounts of specific things that in that moment he might have said. All right, but putting two and two together, there's likely imagine the situation. This guy, like similar to Ptolemy Philopator, what he did. This guy, he's pissed off. Number one, he's pillaging, ravaging, ravishing, taking away all the stuff, goes into the temple. You try to stop him, You know, the God of the, he's, man, who the hell is that? You know what I'm saying? Forget all that. I'm not, he doesn't care. All right. And you notice the God of gods is with a capital G. All right. So he did all of this, magnified himself against everybody, all gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that that is determined shall be done. Okay, now the reason he was able to prosper, all right, till the indignation be accomplished was because the Lord was for a moment, for a period, upset. He was angry, all right, with us. And that's why he allowed Antiochus, all right, to prosper in his deeds that were destructive to Israel, because that was the period of indignation. So he was going to prosper in doing so, not because he was great, but because the Lord was angry at us, all right, till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. So the things that were determined to happen upon Israel were going to be done, namely by the hands of Antiochus, all right, because the Lord really did use him, all right, to take out his anger on us. All right, now we're going to read an account of that. This is of him being allowed to prosper. Okay, this is the book of 2nd Maccabees chapter 5 verse 17. And so haughty was Antiochus in mind, that he considered not that the Lord was angry for a while, the indignation, for the sins of them that dwelt in the city, and therefore his eye was not upon the place. See? So that's why Antiochus was able to prosper, because the Lord was angry at us for the sins, all right? So therefore he took his eye, you know, away from that place, and that's why Antiochus was able to do what he did. See, when Heliodorus came, all right, it's actually even going to say it. When Heliodorus came, the Lord's eye was upon us because Onias was high priest, and we were living in an orderly fashion. So even Heliodorus said that the Most High has his eye on that place. All right. But at the time of Antiochus, the Lord was upset and took his eye off that place. All right. He had that indignation against us. And that's why Antiochus was allowed to prosper. It says, for had they not been formerly wrapped in many sins, had we not been going off, this man Antiochus, as soon as he had come, the second he pulled up to do what he was going to do, had forthwith been scourged and put back from his presumption. He would have got his ass beat, all right, and whatever intents that he set to do would not have prospered, as Heliodorus was. See, whom Seleucus the king sent to view the treasury. So the same way Heliodorus got beat, Antiochus would have got beat the same way. All right. Nonetheless, as it says here, he shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, because the Most High was upset. Verse 37, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. Okay, so Antiochus didn't regard, you know, in the sense, you know, the Greek gods, okay, because his fathers now, of course, they're all Edomites, all right, the Greeks and you know, the latter Romans, okay, but there was still that separation, all right. So Antiochus' father is considered Greeks. He didn't regard their gods, all right. Now it says, nor the desire of women, and when you go into certain translations, you know, they have it as Antiochus not regarding the desire of actual women. But in this context, you know, you also have other translations that will put it in the sense that he didn't regard any gods, all right, that were favored by women, all right, because, you know, it really would be a little out of place. You know, here it is, you're talking about him not regarding the gods of his fathers, but then you throw in him not regarding women, and then you throw in nor any other god. So it makes more sense, all right, to go with the fact that he wasn't going to regard the God of his fathers, nor any God that was favored by women, nor any God at all. You know, because you had certain gods and goddesses that were more, you know, their fans were more women, their supporters. You know, yeah, you even in the scriptures, it even tells you about the Queen of Heaven. You know, you also have it tells you how the women wept for Tammuz. Okay, how they bake cakes, I believe, to the Queen of Heaven. You know, and you also have certain gods and goddesses of like fertility and so on and so forth. You know, which were desired by women. Okay, it says, "For he shall magnify himself above all." See, so he didn't regard them because he felt that he was above them all. Okay, that's why he had that epithet, Theos Epiphanes, God manifest, even though he was just a man. Verse 38, "But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things." All right, and when you go into this, it actually tells you in the book of Second Maccabees that we're going to get that this was dealing with Jupiter. All right, see, when you look up the word here, you know, amongst other gods, all right, but this is the one, the god that's actually mentioned, all right, in the book of Second Maccabees that Antiochus honored was Jupiter. Okay, so it says the god of forces. When you look up the word forces, all right, it says here human protection, refuge, place or means of safety, protection, refuge, stronghold. Right, so now when you go to the book of Second Maccabees, chapter 6, verse 1, it says, not long after this, the king sent an old man, Salakia. All right, the king sent an old man of Athens to compel the Jews to depart from the laws of their fathers and not to live after the laws of God, and to pollute also the temple of Jerusalem, and to call it the temple of Jupiter Olympius, right? And that in Gerizim of Jupiter, the defender of strangers, okay, as they did desire that dwelt in the place. Okay, so you know, going back to Daniel 11 and verse 38, so it says here, "But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and precious and pleasant things," because Jupiter is a Roman god. Now the Greeks, all right, had Zeus, and you know, some say, you know, it's pretty obvious, like Jupiter is sort of like the Roman version of Zeus. Okay, but nonetheless, the Greeks didn't know Jupiter. All right, they dealt with Zeus. Okay, see, it says the Romans regarded Jupiter as the equivalent of the Greek Zeus. All right, so and it tells you Jupiter, it says, known as Jove, is the god of the sky and thunder, and the king of gods in ancient Roman religion and mythology. All right, Jupiter was the chief deity of the Roman state religion throughout the Republican and imperial eras, so on and so forth. Okay, so continuing, it says, "Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange god." Okay, now when you go back to Second Maccabees, remember it says that they polluted the temple of Jerusalem. All right, and also that in Gerizim, all right, and called it he honored Jupiter in Jerusalem, all right, and in Gerizim, and Jerusalem was a stronghold. Okay, so thus shall he do in the most strongholds, you know, as well as other places as well. Okay, with a strange god whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many. All right, so now those gods, not only Jupiter, but those other gods in which Antiochus, you know, either favored, all right, or honored, he caused those gods to rule over many by causing, you know, basically everybody in his land to leave, all right, to leave the gods of their fathers, all right, and to worship the gods that Antiochus set up. And I believe that another god was also Bacchus or Dionysus, all right, which is spoken about also in the book of Maccabees. Let me see, what was the term? Let's see. Olives. Let's see. Okay, it wasn't olives. It was ivy. Ivy. There we go. All right. Second Maccabees 6 and 7. There we go. It says, actually, I still have it here, right here, so I could just pull it up. It says now going down, because remember, it says that he shall cause, where we at? He shall cause them, those gods, to rule over many. Okay, so now when you go into it, Second Maccabees, the 6th chapter, and the 5th verse, it says, the altar also was filled with profane things, which the law forbiddeth. All right. Neither was it lawful for a man to keep Sabbath days or ancient fasts, or to profess himself to be at all a Jew. Verse 7. And in the day of the king's birth month, all right, or the king's birth every month, they were brought by bitter constraint to eat of the sacrifices. And when the fast of Bacchus was kept, see, Bacchus. All right, now who is Bacchus? All right, it says right here, Dionysus, also spelled Dionysos, also called Bacchus. All right, or in Rome, Liber Pater, in Greco-Roman religion, a nature god of fruitfulness and vegetation, especially known as a god of wine and ecstasy. All right, dealing with feasts. All right, that partying spirit. Okay, that's Bacchus and or Dionysus. Okay, so what did he do in the book of Second Maccabees 6 and 7? It says that they were brought by bitter constraint, so by force, to eat of the sacrifices. And when the fast of Bacchus was kept, the Jews were compelled to go in procession to Bacchus, right, carrying ivy. See? So this is also an example of how he caused these gods to rule over many by forcing us to worship them. Okay? It says, and shall divide the land for gain. All right, because what he did was, setting up garrisons, all right, and these strongholds to separate the lands. But he would also give authority, all right, or charge of these different lands to different people. Now, an example was Menelaus, all right, who went to Antiochus, and what did he do? He gained, all right, jurisdiction over that land of Judea by paying Antiochus. Okay, so for gain, Antiochus gained that money, all right, basically selling the authority of that land to Menelaus. Okay. So going down verse 40, it says, and at the time of the end. So now from verse 40, all right, it jumps. All right, the angel recaps, I should say. All right, he recaps. This isn't like a continuation after the second time Antiochus has already gone into Egypt. This is like a recap. So he's telling him, after he tells him all this, verse 40 says, okay, so now at the time of the end, all right, this is what's going to happen. All right, so verse 40 is basically recapping that time that Antiochus ended up going back into, going into Egypt. He gets stopped by the ships of Kittim and all of that. Okay, that's at the time of the end, because I believe, look, it says it right here. Daniel 11 and 27, and both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. See? So it's speaking about the same time period. The angel is just recapping, all right, what was going to happen with the 6th Syrian war. All right, so verse 40 is dealing with the 6th Syrian war again. All right, and it says, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. All right, and this was, as we read in the history, you had Ptolemy the sixth Philometor. At the time, Egypt was being ruled by regents, okay, by regents. And what they did, all right, how they pushed at him was by trying to come up into trying to come up into Palestine or Syria and gain some of that, some of that land over there. All right. Let's see. It says the guardians of the King Ptolemy VI Philometor demanded the return of Coal Syria in 170 BC, declaring war on the Seleucids on the assumption that the kingdom was divided after Antiochus' murder of his nephew. However, Antiochus had prepared more thoroughly and launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, defeating a Ptolemaic force and seizing Pelusium. All right, so that's what the angel is telling Daniel here. See, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind when he launched that preemptive strike. All right, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. All right, and that's also written of in First Maccabees. I actually have it here. The first chapter, okay. Verse 17. First Maccabees 1:17. Wherefore, actually verse 16. Now when the kingdom was established before Antiochus, he thought to reign over Egypt, that he might have the dominion of 2 realms. Wherefore he entered into Egypt with a great multitude, with chariots and elephants and horsemen and a great navy. All right, and made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt, but Ptolemy was afraid of him and fled, and many were wounded to death. All right, so going back to Daniel 11, at the time of the end, shall the king of the south push at him. All right, Ptolemy, basically under the rule of those regents, declared war on Antiochus, and Antiochus launched a preemptive strike into Egypt. Right, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. All right, did we not just read that here? Okay, it says with chariots and elephants and horsemen and a great navy. Okay, it says and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over, meaning Antiochus with that army was going to defeat Ptolemy, and he was going to enter, okay, and he was going to take over certain lands and in Egypt. Okay, as it says in the secular history, that what did Antiochus do? It says he launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, defeating a Ptolemaic force and seizing Pelusium, which was a city, all right, in Egypt. Okay, verse 41 says he shall enter also into the glorious land. All right, and where's the glorious land? Israel. See, but this is we've already read about this in the previous verses. So, like I said, the angel is recapping. All right, that overall, this is what Antiochus was going to do. All right, he shall enter also into the glorious land, which is Israel, and many countries shall be overflown, because he did not only did he conquer Israel, but he conquered other lands as well. All right, shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. All right, which is dealing with these lands. All right. Now the reason, all right, when it means that they shall escape out of his hand, meaning that the reason, all right, that they escaped out of his hand was because his focus was not on necessarily Edom, Moab, and Ammon. His main focus, because Edom, Moab, and Ammon are all surrounding Israel. But whenever Antiochus was in that area of Palestine, his main focus was who? Israel. Okay, whether he was putting hell on us or stealing from us, whatever the case may be, his main focus was Israel. So he didn't really put that hell on Edom and Moab and Ammon, all right, as he did on Israel. That's why it says that they shall escape out of his hand. All right, see, it didn't say that he went up into the land of Edom and Moab and Ammon, and he destroyed, he did great massacres and, all of that. And that's also why it tells you that when Jason fled, where did he go? He fled to the land of Ammon. Why? Right? Because he could so-called get safety or succor over there, because Antiochus's focus wasn't really on those lands. All right. Verse 42 says, He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Okay, meaning going back to when he went into Egypt and he took over, the different lands he conquered. He took over certain cities in Egypt. All right, First Maccabees, the first chapter, once again, verse 19. It's actually verse 18. And made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt, but Ptolemy was afraid of him and fled, and many were wounded to death. Thus they got the strong cities in the land of Egypt. All right. Thus they got the strong cities in the land of Egypt. Daniel 11:42. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Verse 43. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. See? And we're going to read that. First Maccabees 1. All right, and 19. Thus they got the strong cities in the land of Egypt, and he took the spoils thereof. All right. So as we just read, that he was going to have power over the treasures of gold and of silver and of all the precious things of Egypt. Was that not spoils? It says, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps, meaning when he took, because where are these? These are in Egypt. So when he took over those lands, the areas of Libya and Ethiopia became easily accessible to him. All right, because he had control. All right, over those areas. All right, when he took over Egypt. Okay. Verse 44 says, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. All right, now when he was in Egypt, okay, let's actually read it. There was news brought to him, all right, that, basically that Jason had attacked, and there was a lot of chaos going on in Judea. Okay, so he thought that Judea had revolted. And as we're going to read, it says he left Egypt with a furious mind, all right, to come and basically do damage and destruction to Israel. All right. So it says here, 2 Maccabees chapter 5 verse 11, and this is after Jason had done the things he did in Israel. It says, now when that was done came to the king's car, he thought that Judea had revolted, whereupon removing out of Egypt in a furious mind, he took the city by force of arms. Right? Key word, in a furious mind. See, so when the tidings, when the news was brought to him, all right, when he was in Egypt, he shall go forth. He left with great fury, with a furious mind, to destroy and utterly to make away many. Now, notice it says out of the east and out of the north, because where Antiochus was over there in Egypt, if you look at like this area, like Pelusium, for example, which was one of the areas that he had taken control over. Okay, as a matter of fact, it says here this is in the Egypt's Nile Delta. Right, so now let's look up Egypt Nile Delta map. All right, and it basically shows, all right, this whole area right here. So when we come back to this image, you see this area right here, Nile Delta. So he was basically able to get control over this region. Now, from this area, if you want to, from where Jerusalem would be at, that would be considered northeast. Okay, so when all hell, things are going on here, Jason is doing all his madness. If they're gonna bring news to him, where's the news gonna come from? Based on where he is at this moment, it's gonna be from the east and from the north, because that's where all the chaos was going forth. All right. So when he got that news, he went forth, he left and came towards, Jerusalem to destroy, which he did, and utterly make away many who were Jakes. All right. Verse 45 says, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. All right. Now, what it means by he shall plant the tabernacle of his palace, all right, a palace is where you dwell. Okay, now as a king, you may have your capital, but you also have certain cities or strongholds or areas that you can dwell in, okay, within the different perspective regions that you have control over. So one of those cities, all right, or strongholds that Antiochus had, where he could dwell in, all right, that wasn't his capital, was Beth Sura, okay, or in the Apocrypha sometimes they'll write it as Beth Zor, okay, and it says here that he was gonna plant the tabernacles of his palace, all right, that take over that city, or build that stronghold between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Okay, now when you look at where Beth Sura is at, okay, Beth Sura is basically in, all right, the mountain range of Jerusalem, of Judea, all right, of Israel, I should say, okay, and it's between the Dead and the Mediterranean Sea, the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So let's actually see if I could Beth. All right, let's do Beth Zor. Still talking about the same place. All right, if we could just get a good. All right, here we go. So here you have Beth Zor, all right, which is also known as Beth Sura, okay, and then here you have the Dead Sea, and then here you have the Mediterranean Sea, all right, and this area that you see here. The reason it looks like this is because this is the mountain range, all right, of Israel, okay. So this is where he had placed or built a city or stronghold or whatever, a place where he could dwell, okay, in the holy mountains, all right, the holy mountain which is in Israel, and it was located between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, all right, as it says here, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas, all right, in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. All right, so now we're gonna get another account of this. This is First Maccabees chapter 6, okay, showing you that this is actually talking about Beth Sura, that location. All right, because that was one of the areas where Antiochus had taken over. So it says, moreover, now this was when Antiochus was in Persia, trying to pillage, and get some money or whatnot, steal and rob and all that. So as he was in Persia, okay, it says, moreover, there came one who brought him tidings into Persia. And they basically brought him news that, of what was going on, how, Jake was fighting back against Lysias and those that Antiochus had left. All right, because when Antiochus left to Persia, he left part of his army with Lysias to handle Jake, while he went over there in east to Persia. So as he's there, they bring him news like, yo, your army's them Jews are whooping your ass. They taking back their strongholds. They taking back all the cities and stuff that you built, the garrisons and all of that. All right. So it says, First Maccabees chapter 6, verse 5. Moreover, there came one who brought him tidings into Persia, that the armies which went against the land of Judea were put to flight, and that Lysias, who went forth first with a great power, was driven away of the Jews, and that they were made strong by the armor and power and store of spoils which they had gotten of the armies whom they had destroyed. So Jake took down the Antiochus armies, and they'll take their gear. It says also that they had pulled down the abomination which he had set up upon the altar in Jerusalem, and that they had compassed about the sanctuary with high walls. So this was basically as we were fighting back and taking back our control of our land. All right, we pulled down the different abominations, the altars and stuff they built. All right, it says, and compassed about the sanctuary with high walls, we built a defense. Okay, it says as before, because what did they do? They broke down those defenses that we had when they first took over. So when we took back control, we built those defenses back up. So it says as before, and his city Beth Sura. All right, now to get more clarity, what I did was I looked up the different translations of First Maccabees 6 and 7. All right, which is just reworded the same thing, talking about the same thing. So when you go to First Maccabees 6 verse 7, these are the different translations of it, where it says they had taken down the disgusting thing that he had set up upon the altar in Jerusalem. Furthermore, they had surrounded the sanctuary and also Lysias' town, Beth Zor, with high walls like before. Okay, it says, keep in mind what it said in Daniel, that this was going to be he was going to plant the tabernacle of his palace, all right, in this area, Beth Zor. All right, so it says, another translation, the DRA says, and that they had thrown down the abomination which he had set up upon the altar in Jerusalem, and that they had compassed about the sanctuary with high walls as before, and Bethsura also his city. Okay. Once again, I read the GNT translation. It says, the Jews had pulled down the thing they called the awful horror that Antiochus had built on the altar in Jerusalem. They had also surrounded the temple with high walls, as it had been before, and had taken and fortified the town of Beth Zor, one of the king's own towns. See, so we took over this land, because originally it didn't belong, all right, to Antiochus, but when he took it over, he set it up basically as his. Okay, so when we started taking our land back, taking back control, we took it back and fortified it. But notice it called it one of the king's own towns. So it was a place that he had set his tabernacle, all right, or planted his tabernacle, and that place happened to be located between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, all right, which is in Israel. Okay, so and then the latter part says, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. So after doing all of this, at the end of it all, he was going to come to his end, meaning he was going to die. All right, and none shall help him. Now you can read about how Antiochus died in 2 Maccabees, the 9th chapter. I'm not going to read it because it's a fairly lengthy chapter, but you can definitely read the whole chapter, and it tells you how he died. All right, basically he was on his way, to come and do damage to the Israelites, and the Lord smote him, as it says here, with an incurable and invisible plague, where his body basically started to break down while he was alive. It started to decompose, and you had like the worms and stuff coming out, and his stench was so bad. All right, so as he was going through that, nobody was able to help him. All right, he basically died of that pain, even though he tried to repent, he tried to glorify the Lord and all of that. It didn't do him any good. All right, none helped him, and he basically died. Okay, so yeah, that was pretty much it. Okay, from the 36th verse on down to the 45th verse. All right, and it's pretty much, the whole chapter is pretty much just going into history. All right, which at the time it was given to Daniel, it was prophecy, because it hadn't happened yet. Okay, but now we know that's history because it has all happened. Okay, so Daniel, the 11th chapter, an overall summation of it would be dealing with the 6 Syrian wars. All right, because it ended there. All right, when you look up the 6 Syrian wars, and it's just going into details of what happened, who, but mainly how these wars affected Israel. Okay, that's the vision that the angel gave, broke down to Daniel in the 11th chapter. All right, so Lord willing, that was edifying unto the elect. I'm putting it together in a playlist. If you go to the playlist section, all right, of the channel, you'll see it there. All right, so you can, if you're interested, you can see the whole thing. All right, but once again, Lord willing, that was edifying unto the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Rakha Kodash. Until next time, Shalom.